just 10 years, Steven Bartlett has become one of the most famous entrepreneurs in the UK, host of Europe's top podcast for the third year in a row, and a major player in British cultural life. The co-founder of a globally successful marketing company at just 22, he soon came to national prominence.
Well, now 29-year-old Steven Bartlett is a multi-millionaire entrepreneur, making history by becoming the youngest ever dragon to join BBC One's hit series Dragon's Den.
Have we got a deal?
Yes, we have a deal.
Yeah, we have a deal.
Oh, amazing.
And as host of the hit podcast, The Diary of a CEO. But in the last 18 months, there's been a noticeable shift in the guests and subject matter of his podcast.
Yeah, we live in a toxic nutritional landscape.
I'm sorry that the medical establishment has not come to recognize what I'm saying.
I think humanity is in terrible danger.
Bringing fringe theories into the mainstream. And it's raised concerns amongst leading health experts.
A lot of these podcasters put out there like, oh, we're just giving people information. No, you're not. You're giving them misinformation.
Because just kind of going through
Steven Bartlett's #1 podcast, The Diary of a CEO, first launched in 2017, is known for its in-depth personal interviews with high-profile figures. It's consistently been near the top of the UK and international podcast charts. The podcast content, made into videos for his YouTube channel, has grown to over 8 million subscribers over the last 3 years.
They also resigned the day after.
For the first few years, it focused on business and success, with guests like the former CEO of banking app Monzo and celebrities like influencer Molly May and the late singer Liam Payne. But earlier this year, a viral clip from Bartlett's podcast came up while I was scrolling on my phone.
From everything I know now, I've reluctantly come to the conclusion that the COVID vaccine introduction has had a catastrophic net negative effect on society. In my mind,
it was taken from an episode where Bartlett interviewed Dr. Aseem Malhotra, a cardiologist who spread misinformation about COVID-19 vaccines. Dr. Malhotra was someone who became prominent and controversial during the pandemic. So I checked out the full episode.
The COVID vaccine introduction has had a catastrophic overall net negative effect on the population.
Vaccines had a catastrophic effect? This is not something supported by the weight of scientific evidence. And Bartlett didn't pick up on this bold claim, instead referring to his own experience with COVID.
I remember getting COVID. I used to live on the top floor of this building, and I remember I've never experienced anything quite as bizarre as the symptom set that I had when I got COVID.
Later in the episodes, he seems to justify hosting Malhotra on the podcast.
You know, one of the things I think we have to reflect on is some of those amazing people you talked about, like Martin Luther King, and I don't know whether it's the suffragettes or Gandhi, or whoever it might be. Their ideas in their time were received equally horrifically. And now those are things that we all consider to be true and very important as it relates to maybe science or just social issues on equality.
Cecile Simmons is a health disinformation researcher.
What's interesting about, I think, Steven Bartlett's tone certainly is that he's quite amenable to his guests. I don't think he asks a lot of challenging questions. It's quite a friendly environment. And certainly when he has profiled people who have spread misinformation, I haven't seen a lot of contextualization of who these people are. I recognise a lot of Bartlett's guests as known spreaders of misinformation. Some of the guests do give legitimate health advice, but it seems like a departure from the previous tone of his podcast. Over the past 6 months, nearly half of the podcast's episodes have featured guests focused on health topics. Why has there been such a definitive shift? What we're seeing is that health-related content tends to do really well online. Certainly in the way he presents his videos, it's a very health-related clickbait content with scary titles, with this thing is toxic, this thing is going to kill you, and we know that does really well online with the algorithm, amplifying that. We also know that he has financial stakes in health and wellness companies, and once you have financial interests, you have further interest in focusing on health and nutrition. I tracked the podcast over the last 18 months and noticed the uptick in health-related episodes.
Then, I fact-checked 15 full episodes from April to November with the advice of 4 medical experts. We found an average of 14 harmful claims, not backed up by scientific consensus, per episode. We defined harmful claims as advice that, if followed, could lead to patient harm. Dr. David Robert Grimes, cancer researcher and science communicator, and Professor Heidi Larson, public health researcher and director of the Vaccine Confidence Project, checked out some of the clips.
Is a distinguished naturopathic physician.
Wow. Okay, so naturopathic medicine is not a legitimate thing.
In that month.
This guest, known as the glucose goddess, claimed to help women reverse polycystic ovary syndrome.
In my second book, I ran a study. 3 females who were in the program doing my hacks for just a month got their period back and were able to get pregnant in that month just with my hacks.
3 is a huge sample. Just joking.
One disease like
Dr. Mark Hyman is a functional medicine doctor. Functional medicine is a form of alternative medicine that encompasses a number of unevidenced and disproven treatments. He was a guest in April. Dr. Mark Hyman was already a celebrity doctor before appearing on the podcast.
You've been able to help these kids with autism improve and in some cases actually reverse autism.
Autism can't be reversed. Here, he's referencing an unproven theory that there's harmful mercury in vaccines.
There's enough evidence to say that mercury is one of the most toxic compounds on the planet. Like, why would you want to put that on your kid?
But the podcast fails to mention his controversies. Here's how they introduced him.
One of the world-leading doctors in functional medicine and an expert in helping people understand how they can live their longest, healthiest life.
Diseases are one disease.
And here's what he says on his episode of The Diary of a CEO.
Gluten can cause everything from osteoporosis to autism to schizophrenia to rheumatoid arthritis to anemia to hair loss, alopecia. I mean, it can cause a million things, and it's one inciting event.
After he claimed gluten causes autism, this is what we next hear from Steven.
Was there any personal experiences that made you more drawn towards focusing your life on health and helping people?
Dr. Grimes had a different reaction.
Gluten can cause everything from osteoporosis to autism to schizophrenia to rheumatoid arthritis to anemia.
No, it can't. That is absolutely false. Autism, for example, is a condition people are born with, right? And it's not caused by their parents' diet or what they have somehow ingested as a child.
Can you tell me why they should stay and listen?
Great question.
Bartlett isn't the first one to amplify these people.
This is the stuff that Joe Rogan's been doing for years, and I have the same criticisms for him. Constantly platforming contrarian, edgy kind of people that claim they have the simple answer to everything or the simple cause of everything, usually with something really controversial, shocking that grabs your attention. It's a great model for getting millions of listeners.
If Biden got shot in the...
Joe Rogan, a comedian and host of the #1 podcast in the United States, has become one of the most powerful media figures in the US.
Controversial.
Many of Rogan and Bartlett's guests cross over.
Controversy with me probably started almost everybody.
And it vibrates.
Because the opinion rushes to my head, that's why it has.
Steven Bartlett and Joe Rogan, I think, have managed to do so well because they are actually quite mainstream figures.
We're rolling. Good to see you, sir. Here we go.
Joe Rogan, for instance, has for a long time said that he's bipartisan, that he's inviting people from across the political spectrum, and that he's, trying to have interesting conversations with interesting guests. And I think that Steven Bartlett has tried to do the same. He says that he wants to interview people from, the world of politics and business. But of course, quite a lot of these figures then shift towards inviting more, I suppose, extreme figures who have peddled anti-vaccine views, who have shown distrust of medical institutions.
In this episode, Bartlett interviews Brett Weinstein. Here, he's recalling an account he heard about the plan to engineer a pandemic.
What we need to do is find that virus and enhance it so that we have a virus that can spread between people.
Why would they want a virus that can spread between people?
Because they're part of a cryptic weapons program.
Okay.
This claim went unquestioned. In October, Bartlett hosted Dr. Thomas Seyfried. Here, he's dismissing the success of proven cancer treatments, including chemotherapy and radiotherapy.
With medieval, I call it medieval approaches to this. Are you kidding me? What they're doing to cancer patients?
Cancer survival has never been better in human history, and that is because of dedicated cancer research around the world.
Then he claimed the ketogenic diet, a diet low in carbs and high in fat and protein, was a treatment solution without chemotherapy.
To manage cancer without toxicity is to simultaneously restrict the two fuels that are needed to drive this dysregulated growth, while transitioning the whole body off to a fuel that the tumor cells can't use, which is fatty acids and ketone bodies.
So for someone that has never heard the term keto before,
Steven clarifies some of the complicated terms.
in a simple way, what are ketones?
Ketones are water-soluble.
At no point in the episode does Steven challenge the suggestion that the keto diet could treat cancer. When we next hear from him, this is what he says.
So what can we learn from our ancestors about cancer? How prevalent was cancer?
If you were a cancer patient who took some of this advice and maybe changed your dietary patterns and became very restrictive when you were undergoing treatment, you could potentially and very realistically get very, very sick and have a much worse health outcome than if you followed recommended advice from your oncologists.
Okay, they don't want to do
They're giving something that feels like it's tangible, it's not going to hurt, but they're way overstretching what the potential value of it is. And the worrisome thing to me is that it sends people away from evidence-based medicine.
This advice can affect people's lives. In comments, people seem to believe the guests.
Billion we have towards the NHS.
Dr. Partha Carr, National Specialty Advisor for Diabetes in the NHS, spoke about patients he has treated who had rejected diabetes medication due to misinformation they'd seen online.
I'll give you an example of somebody who, irrespective of the type of diabetes, was trying to keep themselves off insulin. And they were trying particular dietary modifications and as well as natural supplements. And that resulted in harm because they clearly needed the insulin. So that was in spite of us saying, look, you need to be careful where you're going with this. Clear example of harm.
She's your wife.
Bartlett's popularity brings fringe theories to a new audience.
They promote a lot of pseudoscience, they promote a lot of misinformation, and they promote a lot of talking points that used to be confined to very fringe forums. But, watered down and turned into this more, I suppose, seemingly moderate discussion can give sort of intellectual credence to very pseudoscientific ideas.
Podcasts are becoming one of the largest platforms we go to for news and information.
It's becoming increasingly difficult to pretend that people don't know what the impact of their podcast is.
Ofcom, the broadcasting regulator in the UK, says in cases where the content is harmful, broadcasters must ensure the audience is adequately protected. But currently, podcasts are not covered by these regulations. A spokesperson for Flight Studio, Steven Bartlett's production company, said that The Diary of a CEO is an open-minded, long-form conversation with individuals identified for their distinguished and eminent career and/or consequential life experience. They said each guest is thoroughly researched, offered freedom of expression, and they hear a range of voices, not just those Steven and The Diary of a CEO team necessarily agree with. They said the BBC reviewed a limited proportion of guests out of the nearly 400 broadcasts to date. Dr. Asim Malhotra said he completely accepts there are still some people who disagree with his views. He said that does not mean they've been debunked.
Thank you for joining us this morning, Doctor.
He was on BBC News to speak about heart medication early January 2023. He went on to make misleading claims about COVID vaccines. The BBC said it should have been better prepared to challenge Dr. Malhotra, particularly given his past comments about the vaccine programme. The BBC apologised. Dr. Thomas Seyfried said he stands by the statements he made in the interview. In a response on his podcast, Brett Weinstein said this was not a wild romp through conspiracy. He said the episode was a reasoned discussion. Jessie Chopé, known as the Glucose Goddess, said that she sees reversal of polycystic ovarian syndrome as remission of the condition. She also said she ran a survey-based pilot experiment for her methods with nearly 3,000 participants and did not claim it was peer-reviewed. Dr. Mark Hyman didn't respond to requests for comment.
It just worries me in the sense that it undermines trust in evidence-based medicine, which we need more than ever.
There's a real harm to this. And a lot of these podcasters put out there like, oh, well, we're just giving people information. No, you're not. You're giving them misinformation. And that's a very different and non-empowering thing. It actually imperils all our health.
Is there a risk in having too much meat products?
Bartlett's shift to health may be great for the reach of his podcast. But what's the line between hosting contrarian views versus allowing them to go unchallenged? And what are Steven Bartlett's responsibilities as the host of one of the world's biggest podcasts?